We begin today a study of Sri Aurobindo's translation and commentary of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad in the form in which it is published. The translation is of the first few verses only, and the commentary is limited to the first two verses only. We will dwell primarily on the commentary of the first two verses and only generally study the rest of the verses later, and even then not the whole, because we would like to keep the focus on the form in which Sri Aurobindo articulates his commentary. But before we enter the text proper, it is useful to have a broad perspective of where this stands in the larger body of spiritual and revelatory literature. When we look back at the records of the most ancient spiritual revelations and experiences, we find them recorded in the Veda as an intuitive, revelatory, experiential poetry. What the rishis experienced in their highest spiritual attainments, they articulated in the spontaneous form in which that experience could verbalize itself in sound and rhythm. And therefore we find in the most ancient Vedic texts not only the power of the spiritual experience embedded, but also its articulation in a language which is not yet mental, which is still primarily intuitive, and which therefore lends itself to different kinds of mental understanding, but which can be fully absorbed only if we rise above the mind and allow the intuitive power to permeate our being and reveal directly the experience that they carry. It was so that the Vedic study was taught. In the second phase, we find a shift towards a more mental formulation, which we find expressed in the Upanishadic texts. But the same experience moves now from a high intuitive grade towards a more mental formulation, not yet fully lost in the intellect, bridging still the intuition and the intellect. And it is thus that we see the early Upanishadic texts, including the Isha Upanishad, the Kena Upanishad, and in particular the text we are now going to study, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The later Upanishads move much more into the mental realm, still keeping the old Vedic symbolism and language, still holding at their back the intuitive base from which they emerge, but taking increasingly a more mental form. And thus, traditionally, they speak of principal Upanishads, secondary Upanishads, and so on, in one of the systems of counting 108 Upanishads. But they also carry inherently the same style of study that we are asked to dwell on the deeper intuitive power behind the words and allow that power to illumine the mind. We find a third phase in the development and revelation of the spiritual experience, when this experience, this knowledge, this power of knowledge was sought to be articulated in a form that the popular mind, not so developed, could appreciate or receive, and much more the heart could absorb in the common man. And so we find the same symbols, the same truths articulated in the Puranic traditions in the form of stories, narrations, incidents, but whose deeper meaning still resonates with the Vedic teaching, the Vedic symbols. The gods are given a more personal human form. The stories can often be presented in a more moral or ethical message, but behind there is still this deeper resonance and a continuity from the original Vedic experience. So for children especially, the stories from the Puranas are engrossing, inspiring, but they still carry the link which allows you to enter through those stories back all the way to the most profound spiritual experiences. In his commentaries, Sri Aurobindo began in the Arya with the secret of the Veda and his commentary on the Isha Upanishad parallelly at the same time, while he presented his own spiritual experience and philosophical formulation in the Life Divine and its practice in the Synthesis of Yoga. So he had these 4 books simultaneously being written, one chapter at a time, in the Arya, which incidentally this year will be 100 years since the first issue of the Arya was published. His commentary on the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad was written, it appears, around 1912 and predates the Arya, and is, as it survives at least, partial in that it limits itself only to the first few verses. But in those verses, Sri Aurobindo explains that his intention is not to give, and I read from here, "It is not my intention here, nor is it in my limits possible, to develop the philosophy of the great Aranyaka Upanishad, but only to develop with just sufficient amplitude for entire clearness the ideas contained in its language and involved in its figures. The business of my commentary is to lay a foundation. It is for the thinker to build the superstructure." But this is a very humble expression of what he actually presents, because what he gives as a foundation is the key and the complete opening of the symbols and their secret in these first few verses. Having had that, the rest becomes much easier, and we can draw on his other expressions of the Vedic symbolism from his other works. As a foreword to his commentary, he says, "The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, at once the most obscure and the profoundest of the Upanishads, offers peculiar difficulties to the modern mind. If its ideas are remote from us, its language is still more remote." So there are 2 problems when we face a text like this. The ideas which they communicate may not be common to the present mind, they are unfamiliar. The symbols used are again not familiar, and there is often an effort of the mind to struggle to begin to perceive even the beauty of those symbols. And that very struggle acts as a screen preventing us from gaining the direct intuitive experience. And then there is the language. It is in Sanskrit, but it is also in the Vedic Sanskrit, much more flexible, much more symbolic, much more profound. And of the nature of this language, he makes an observation in his other commentary, I believe on the commentary of the Chandogya, where he says that in the Sanskrit there is the advantage of what we call in English pun. But the pun in English is a very superficial and crude form where you allow for a double meaning to be expressed. But the proper word in English is paronomasia, that is allowing for a multiple meaning. But the word in Sanskrit is shlesha, which could literally be translated as layering or slicing. And this is the power of the Sanskrit language, because it is based on root sounds, that as you articulate something in the natural vibration in which the experience can form itself, it allows for multiple levels of meaning to the mind, to the rational mind. When you go from the rational thought mind towards the intuition, there are several layers we have to cross. The thought mind articulates first at the lowest level in words. It is possible to disengage from the words and hold ourselves purely in thought. We do that, for example, when we translate from one language to another. Through the words we move to the meaning, and then from pure meaning we must articulate in new words and move back to the meaning from the new words and check that it still matches with the meaning that came from the old words. And we are at that point exercising this capacity of the mind to disengage from words and still hold thought. But there is thought. And from thought it is possible to hold back, to stand back, and hold the mind similarly in the domain of pure ideas. And at that point there is no particular thought articulated, but just the idea held, which can now be articulated in many different thoughts, which are all facets or aspects of the idea. And from each thought formulation, you can articulate in many different words, in different languages, but within the same language, of course, in different ways, in different sequences perhaps also. So behind the words, the thought, behind the thoughts, the idea, and we can even abstract a further level to say there is a pure concept behind the idea. But behind that, Mother says, it is possible for us to shift to a level of pure experience. And the experience does not even limit itself to an idea. It can open itself out to many different idea forms. And through each of those, to many thought forms, through each of those, through many verbalizations. So at the level of pure experience, you are actually holding so many more facets of mental knowledge, but it is held in a way that is single, cohesive, comprehensive, one experience. And from there to move into idea or thought or words feels almost like a loss of the completeness, a diminution of the intensity, and even a degeneration and a loss of purity. It is at this level of pure experience that these formulations, both of the Vedic texts and the early Upanishads, is placed. And so, for the mind to fully absorb and appreciate the knowledge contained there, or the knowledge experience that is contained there, it is necessary to train the mind to be able to thus rise through these levels and hold at the level of pure experience. And then the words and the power behind the words automatically unfold and reveal to us their innate meaning experience, and even can give form in our minds in the way necessary according to our temperament or the need of the moment, give form to the particular ideas or words relevant for that situation. So the training for this is in essence the same training that is required to prepare the mind to become more and more intuitivized, to begin to dwell at the level which is more intuitive than verbalized, rationalized thoughts and words. This thinking at the level of pure experience is the first point at which the intellectual mind enters the domain of the intuitive experience. So, with this background, we will straight away enter into the text, and later in one of the sessions subsequently we will look at some of the guidelines that Sri Aurobindo offers in one of his articles in the Foundations of Indian Culture on how the text of the Upanishad is to be appreciated, how it is to be studied. And in that text, which we will see later, he says the Upanishads are at the same time at once profound religious scripture, for they are a record of the deepest spiritual experiences, documents of revelatory and intuitive philosophy of an inexhaustible light, power and largeness, and whether written in verse or cadenced prose, spiritual poems of an absolute and unfailing inspiration, inevitable in phrase, wonderful in rhythm and expression. It is the expression of a mind in which philosophy and religion and poetry are made one, because this religion does not end with a cult nor is limited to a religio-ethical aspiration, but rises to an infinite discovery of God, of self, of our highest, and whose reality of spirit and being, and whole reality of spirit and being, and speaks out of an ecstasy of luminous knowledge and an ecstasy of moved and fulfilled experience. This philosophy is not an abstract intellectual speculation about truth or a structure of the logical intelligence, but truth seen, felt, lived, held by the inmost mind and soul in the joy of utterance of an assured discovery and possession. And this poetry is the work of the aesthetic mind lifted up beyond its ordinary field to express the wonder and beauty of the rarest spiritual self-vision and the profoundest illumined truth of self and God and universe. So this is from the text from the Foundations of Indian Culture, but it prepares us for what we will now read. The title of the Upanishad itself, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, is suggestive. Brihad is large, vast. Aranyaka, literally translated, is forest. So many have translated the title of this Upanishad to mean large forest because it must have been taught in a big forest. But the Upanishad does not waste words. It uses words very carefully, and so we must look for a deeper meaning behind. And forest in the Vedic symbol is the symbol of the multiplicity of life. And Brihad is also a term used to describe the vastness of the truth consciousness of the supermind, where all multiplicity is seen from the vision of oneness. And so the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad can be described as that vast vision, all encompassing, all inclusive, of the whole multiplicity of life, which is then expressed as an Upanishad. In the very first verse, it gives us this vast vision, but from a unitary perspective. Before we read the verse and then Sri Aurobindo's commentary, I will place before us a simple exercise which will help us to understand why the verse takes this particular form and symbol. And the exercise here would be to try to give form to our own vision of the oneness of the material universe. If we were to see the universe around us, how could we articulate the sense of the whole thing as one? If we first look at the world around us through our physical sight, we see immediately before us the land, the forests, the ocean, the sky, and perhaps we will describe it in a certain way. But it would still be made up of pieces. Can we somehow weld those pieces into a single description? The word landscape in English gives us a sense of a broad encompassing space, but still limits to land with its scaping. And if our vision now went wider, beyond the immediate physical sight, to look at the whole material universe, to see the whole earth, to see the solar system, the galaxies, and the totality not only of the matter seen as suns and galaxies, but even the so-called empty space which is seen as full of material energy. How would we describe this totality of the material universe? And you will remember in our other study of the supramental manifestation on earth, Sri Aurobindo described how it's possible to see the universe as one being moving to manifest himself. And if we were to hold such a picture in our mind, one divine being, one divine presence, one divine existence, full of its own innate consciousness bliss, moving out as power of consciousness into infinite movements of whirling energy, currents and eddies, infinitely diverse, pouring out, but a single existence, a single being, flowing and unfolding himself in manifestation. Such would be perhaps our sense of the oneness of the material universe. And the words we use naturally are words such as being, existence, consciousness, flowing energy, bliss of movement, and so on. If this is articulated in a language rhythm that naturally articulates the vibration of the experience, we would use the word Ashva. And Sri Aurobindo explains, Ashva meant originally being, existence, substance. From the sense of speed and strength, it came to mean horse. Today, if you say in Sanskrit Ashva, people say, oh, you're talking of a horse. But the original sense is this being, existence, substance. So when you look at the whole universe as this being, existence, substance, flowing and unfolding itself, the word Ashva captures that. The word is therefore used to indicate material existence. And the horse, the image usually conveyed by his name, by this name, is taken as a symbol of universal existence in Annam, in material existence. So the symbol of universal existence in matter is Ashva, the horse. And then he says, the horse is symbolic and the sacrifice is symbolic. We have in it an image of the Virat Purusha, of Yajñeya Purusha, God expressing himself in the material universe. You will recall also from our earlier studies in the Isha Upanishad, the description of Brahman in his four poises, and the most material manifestation, the objective manifestation of the material universe, is described as Virat. Again, the word meaning vast, wide. But this is the form in which Brahman manifests in his objective reality. Behind that are the three other states of Brahman: the dream state, the sleep state, and then the transcending. So this Ashva, horse, being, existence, substance, is symbol of the universal existence, image of the Virat Purusha, God expressing himself in the material universe. So this is presented here as a footnote when the word horse appears in the translation. So I read the first few words, the first phrase in Sanskrit, and then we read Sri Aurobindo's complete translation of the verse. I won't read the full verse in Sanskrit, but just for the vibration of the Sanskrit words. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Om Ushava Ashvasya Medhyasya Shiraha. Sri Aurobindo's translation. Om, dawn is the head of the horse sacrificial. I read the rest of the verse in translation. The sun is his eye. His breath is the wind. His wide open mouth is fire, the master might universal. Time is the self of the horse sacrificial. Heaven is his back, and the mid-world his belly. Earth is his footing. The regions are his flanks, and the lesser regions their ribs. The seasons his members. The months and the half months are their joints. The days and nights are his standing place. The stars his bones, and the sky is the flesh of his body. The strands are the food in his belly. The rivers are his veins. His liver and his lungs are the mountains. Herbs and plants are his hairs. The rising is his front, and the setting his hinder portion. When he stretches himself, then it lightens, there is lightning. When he shakes his frame, then it thunders. When he urines, then it rains. Speech, verily, is the sound of him. Already in the very opening verse, we have the sense of the symbol here. Grand, vast, all-inclusive. Not an abstract, impersonal universality, but a conscious power. The horse conveys this sense of speed and power and movement, but in this all-inclusive movement and power, everything, every form is symbolic. So Sri Aurobindo has a series of footnotes. That's how the editors have placed it here. The footnotes themselves are taken from some other notes and commentaries that he made on Shankaracharya's translation. But in the way the text goes, Om, dawn is the head of the horse sacrificial. So against the word head, the footnote is because it is the front and beginning. Later he will elaborate. The word used for dawn is Usha. Usha, you will remember, is the goddess of dawn, and you will recall in Sri Aurobindo's Savitri also, it is this goddess Usha who is described as appearing. But in the Vedic language, Usha comes from the root of Ushas, and Ushas is the manifestation, the moving into self-expression and manifestation. So Usha is that conscious power of the divine as he moves into manifestation to reveal and unfold and manifest, express himself. And that's the dawning. The light which was so far held in potential, in sleep, in trance of sleep, now turns to manifest and express itself in an outward movement. So the front of the horse, the head of the horse, is this Usha. Dawn is the head. You see, when we make a pure translation into English, we tend to lose this. If you said it in Sanskrit, Ushava ashvasya medhasya shira. Usha is the head. Usha, and if you hear it in Sanskrit, Usha shira. The manifesting movement is the head. And against the words horse sacrificial, the footnote is what I had read earlier. Ashwa meant originally being, existence, substance. From the sense of speed and strength, it came to mean horse, and the rest of the text which I had already read. Then, the sun is his eye, and the footnote to eye is, because the sun is the master of sight. And again, Sri Aurobindo will elaborate on this. In this whole forward movement of the head as the movement to manifest himself, what is it that sees? That which sees, and it sees what must be manifested, and sees as it manifests, and sees himself in the manifest form. This seeing power, the eye, is the sun. And you see how profound the symbol is. It resonates deep within us in levels which we cannot fully articulate in words, but we can feel that resonance somewhere of the power of the image. And then, his breath is the wind, his wide open mouth is fire, the master might universal. And the footnote, air is the basis of life, fire of strength and expansion. And in the text, time is the self of the horse sacrificial. And in the footnote, time is that which upholds existence in material space and is the soul of it. So this is verse 1, just in the simple translation which Sri Aurobindo presents. And then the verse 2, which also we had commented on. I will read the translation and then move to the commentary. Verse 2. Day was the grandeur that was born before the horse as he galloped. The eastern ocean gave it birth. Night was the grandeur that was born behind him, and its birth was from the other waters. These are the grandeurs that came into being on either side of the horse. He became higher and bore the gods. Vaja and bore the Gandharvas. Arvan and bore the Titans. Ashva and bore mankind. So 4 horses, 4 names of horses are given, and they carry successively the gods, the Gandharvas, the Titans, and then mankind. The sea was his brother, and the sea was his birthplace. Literally, in the Sanskrit, the word is womb. The sea was his brother, and the sea was his womb. Subsequently, section 2 is also translated, and section 3 of the same chapter. But then he stopped the translation after a series of verses, which we will not look at now. And we move now to his commentary. So, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, at once the most obscure and profoundest of the Upanishads, offers peculiar difficulties to the modern mind. If its ideas are remote from us, its language is still more remote. Profound, subtle, extraordinarily rich in rare philosophical suggestions and delicate psychology, it has preferred to couch its ideas in a highly figurative and symbolic language, which to its contemporaries accustomed to this suggestive dialect must have seemed a noble frame for its riches, but meets us rather as an obscuring veil. This is the symbolism. For us, it is almost like an obscuring veil. To draw aside this curtain, to translate the old Vedic language and figures into the form contemporary thought prefers to give to its ideas, is the sole object of this commentary. This contemporary thought is the particular formation of what we call the modern mind. It has its important place, but in relation to the ancient mind, we feel often that there is something important that is lost. The ancient mind was naturally more intuitive. And Sri Aurobindo has some very suggestive observations about the reason for this shift. He says in one of his writings on this, in passing, as a comment, he says that the rapidity with which the modern mind can quickly grow into a sharp, clear, rational form, even from cultures which have lost that habit, shows that this particular development of the intellect had already been attained in the past. And from there, humanity had risen to a more intuitive mind, ready to move to a next level. But in that ascent, there was something incomplete, a gap, a lack, because of which the human mind had to fall back into materiality and rationality to complete that gap, to complete the layer that was undeveloped, incomplete. And having completed that, it has to rise once again to the intuitive and cross over to the beyond. And so what we see of the Vedic text, he suggests, is the peak of that earlier cycle. From a certain lack in that cycle, there was the necessity of the fall back into a materiality and rationality, which we see in the successive stages of the four yugas. And in the last phase, there is what he calls the age of individualism and reason, which we see in the last few hundred years all over the world. But even the form of the individualism and the reason, he says, is different in different cultures. Because of the predominance of the European culture through its colonization of the world, a particular form of mentalization peculiar to the European mind has been as if imposed or imprinted on much of the world. But it need not be like that. Different cultures have their own way of expressing their own intellectual forms and imprints of mind. And Sri Aurobindo makes reference to the mold that he calls the Indian mind, whose recovery he considers extremely important. And because he says the Indian mind has a native familiarity with the sense of the infinite and has a natural affinity with the intuitive. But in principle, every culture expresses in the particular mold that is natural to its aspiration, to its development. And together, the world completes the full development of that possibility of consciousness. So, we are looking at a phase where the age of individualism and reason has asserted itself, and from this we have to pass through a subjective age into the spiritual age. And in this subjective age, the mind turns inwards, having exhausted its explorations of the objective, finding the objective insufficient, even reductionist. The mind turns inwards to find some more profound truth, some more profound experience. And this passage, which Sri Aurobindo described as the subjective age, is what today is described in the popular vocabulary as postmodern and even transmodern. Modern age was that phase when we thought that with our power of intellect, everything can be solved. And the intellect failed us. Modernism has failed, and now we move to a postmodern phase. But Sri Aurobindo warned also that this postmodern or subjective phase has a danger that one can stop short halfway and say, what I feel, what I experience, my likes and dislikes, my emotions, impulses, and sentiments are all that is true. And this would be an error. It would be a false subjectivism. This true subjectivism is to go all the way within to the soul, where we have the certainty, the truth of our innate identity, as well as of the true experience of things, of ourselves and of the world. So the spiritual age begins only when we complete the journey all the way to that true subjectivity of the soul and the self. I point this out here because it is something of this which is required for the full appreciation of the text we are studying. We need to enter a subjective dimension to feel what the verses reveal to us, to allow the verses to resonate within, and to allow that resonance and its forms to emerge and articulate themselves in our thoughts and perceptions. But it would be a partial and even a limited or distorted expression if we allow only a superficial resonance to emerge. The resonance must come from deep within, from the soul itself. And he will tell us about this shortly. So the mindset of that age, of the Vedic rishis, and at least of the rishis, is closer to this, and it is towards this that we will have to turn for the deeper appreciation of this text. And he says, the task is necessarily a little hazardous. I'm going to skip a portion for now where he describes how Shankaracharya had given a commentary, and it is the brilliance of his rational intellect which presented a very insightful commentary. But he says more is possible and more is needed. So I skip that portion which we will take up next time. And then we go now to the heart of what it is that we have to do. He says, the time is fast coming when the human intellect, aware of the mighty complexity of the universe, will be more ready to learn and less prone to dispute and dictate. You see, if you go back 100 years, the greatest minds of humanity were busy trying to read what they wanted to read in these ancient texts. This is how science has discovered reality, and so this is what the text must be trying to say. So you even have people coming up with quotations or translations of these Upanishadic or Vedic texts and saying, so see, this matches exactly what physics says or what chemistry says, or this matches genetic science. But from the more deep perspective, all that physics has revealed to us is a very superficial view even of matter. All that genetics reveals is still a very superficial view of what really happens within the cells. And so to try to read that superficial view into the more profound texts is to lose so much that could have been revealed. So it needs therefore a shift in the mind where the mind realizes that all that I have learned so far does not explain anything. The reality is so much more complex, and aware of the mighty complexity of the universe will be more ready to learn and less prone to dispute and dictate. And we see the signs of this already happening in the world. Then, we shall be willing then to read ancient documents of knowledge for what they contain, instead of attempting to force into them our own truth or get them to serve our philosophic or scholastic purposes. Now he describes what it is we must do to really receive what the text has to give. To enter passively into the thoughts of the old rishis, allow their words to sink into our souls, mold them, and create their own reverberations in a sympathetic and responsive material. Submissiveness, in short, to the Shruti was the theory the ancients themselves had of their method of Vedic knowledge. So this is how the Vedic study was originally taught. First, to enter passively into the thoughts of the old rishis, allow their words to sink into our souls, and it must go all the way. Mold them. When those words enter, they have a power, and their power molds if we allow ourselves to be molded, if we are submissive. Mold them and create their own reverberations in a sympathetic and responsive material. So when that vibration enters into the receptive space of the soul, the material in which that vibration is received begins now to resonate, to vibrate in sympathy with the vibration that comes in. And we must allow that full vibration freely, without distorting, without imposing, without any resistance in our receptive medium. Submissiveness, in short, to the Shruti was the theory the ancients themselves had of their method of Vedic knowledge. And now he quotes the Sanskrit words of this method of knowledge. Giram upashrutim chara, stoman abhiswara, abhigrinihi aruva. 4 stages. So the words of the Shruti, dwell on them, graze on them, assimilate, absorb them, and then let the affirmation, the stoma, articulate itself in sympathetic vibration, absorb, receive profoundly, vibrate in the delight. So Sri Aurobindo now explains this in English. To listen in soul to the old voices and allow the Shruti in the soul to respond, to vibrate, first obscurely, in answer to the Vedantic hymn of knowledge, to give the response, the echo, and last, to let that response gain in clarity, intensity, and fullness. This is the reason why the Vedic form of teaching did not permit the use of books or writing for the Vedic texts. They made a distinction between the Shruti and the Smriti. The Shruti, which is heard, the Smriti, which is remembered. The Smriti was conventional, more mental knowledge, could be written down, could be read and absorbed through reading. But the Shruti, which is heard, not with the physical hearing, but the intuitive revelation, has to be received in the vibration directly. And it has to be heard and received in the soul. And so he says here, allow the Shruti in the soul to respond. So as the words enter, the true knowledge, the intuitive knowledge of the soul now has to reveal itself and respond in the vibration in us. But at first the vibration is obscure. We feel, as we now experienced when we read the first verse and a few words of Sri Aurobindo's commentary, we feel something within us deep inside, as if feeling a familiarity, a resonance. We sense something profound in the symbol behind the words used. And so it is obscure. We are not fully aware, but we are aware that there is something deep. So, to vibrate first obscurely in answer to the Vedantic hymn of knowledge, to give the response the echo. And last, to let that response gain in clarity, intensity, and fullness. 3 steps. As we dwell on this, as we remain silent in our mind and allow the vibration and the imprint and the evocation of the knowledge to emerge, it becomes more clear. It's as if we awaken to that innate knowing. Our consciousness begins to experience rather than think out in words. It begins to receive at the level of pure experience. And that's when you experience the clarity, and then it grows in intensity. The experience comes into fullness until at some point it overwhelms the whole being, and with our own physical eyes and physical senses, in our physical consciousness, we see, feel, and experience what the Rishi experienced and saw. And from clarity through intensity, and then the experience grows in fullness. It grows until it becomes complete. All the facets of the completeness of the experience dawn on us. So this is the method of Vedic knowledge. And he says, this is the principle of interpretation that I have followed. Mystical perhaps, but not necessarily more unsound than the insistence and equally personal standards of the logician and the scholar. And for the rest, where no inner experience of truth sheds light on the text, to abide faithfully by the wording of the Upanishad and trust my intuitions. For I hold it right to follow the intuitions, especially in interpreting the Upanishad, even at the risk of being accused of reading mysticism into the Vedanta. Because the early Vedantists, it seems to me, were mystics, not in the sense of being vague and loose-thoughted visionaries, but in the sense of being intuitional symbolists, who regarded the world as a movement of consciousness and all material forms and energies as external symbols and shadows of deeper and ever deeper internal realities. It is not my intention here, nor is it in my limits possible to develop the philosophy of the great Aranyaka Upanishad, but only to develop with just sufficient amplitude for entire clearness the ideas contained in its language and involved in its figures. The business of my commentary is to lay a foundation. It is for the thinker to build the superstructure. So this is Sri Aurobindo's own approach with which he leads us into it, and we will follow in his footsteps, allowing him to lead us. And we see why it is so important for the texts such as this to be absorbed in the vibration of the words, because it is the Shruti which we have to receive. And I was describing earlier the reason why they taught the Vedic texts only orally. For this reason, because of the vibration of the experience which must be communicated. And for this reason, the words had to be absorbed and imbibed, to use the modern phrase, by heart. Meaning, you had to absorb the words until they became a part of your very soul. And they emerged from the soul as your own words, as your own experience, as your own expression and formulation of the perception and seeing experience. So we had tried to do something like this in our study of the Isha Upanishad. But even more profoundly, this text needs it. When the words are a part of our own being in the deepest soul, when we articulate those words, they emerge as if our own experience unfolding. Such was the approach for the method of Vedic knowledge. So we will take up the text in its detail next time. For now, we can simply read the first verse in translation and meditate on it for a few minutes. Om. Dawn is the head of the horse sacrificial. The sun is his eye. His breath is the wind. His wide open mouth is fire, the master might universal. Time is the self of the horse sacrificial. Heaven is his back, and the midworld his belly. Earth is his footing. The regions are his flanks, and the lesser regions their ribs. The seasons his members. The months and the half-months are their joints. The days and nights are his standing place. The stars his bones, and the sky is the flesh of his body. The strands are the food in his belly. The rivers are his veins. His liver and his lungs are the mountains. Herbs and plants are his hairs. The rising is his front, and the setting his hinder portion. When he stretches himself, then it lightens. When he shakes his frame, then it thunders. When he urines, then it rains. Speech, verily, is the sound of him.